So what we want to do right now is give you an opportunity to think about some of the metaphors that guide or come up in your classroom and in the discipline that you teach. And I know many of you teach elementary school, so you have to cover all of the subjects. So for this activity, we just want you to choose one subject to think about. And we're going to take a look at those and figure out where those, or how are those metaphors helpful and how are they misleading or limiting. So for example, if we think about, to do some convergent thinking together, if we think about education and the metaphors that guide education or the practice of teaching, a metaphor we were talking about the other day is my bag of tricks, right? Have you heard teachers say this, right? My bag of tricks, which can be helpful. It's a helpful metaphor because it suggests that I think about strategies and I have things that I have picked that work for me and that I use. It's also misleading because it suggests that I trick my students into learning, right? So it's a metaphor we're familiar with, but might not be, it is limiting. Okay, we won't pass any judgment on it, we'll say it's limiting. So what are some of the metaphors that your students are going to encounter in the disciplines of your classroom that are misleading, or what are the ones that are helpful? So I have some examples on the sheet that's out in front of you. So we'll read a couple and then I'll give you time to talk together and maybe brainstorm a couple that occur in your classroom that you think might be interesting to address with students. So if you're teaching the discipline of science, there are a number of metaphors, like the cosmos is like a string symphony. So for those of you who teach science, how is that helpful? How might that be misleading? In social studies, we hear all the time that America is a melting pot. Well, how is that helpful to think about, and how is that misleading, right? That suggests that we all have to melt down to be one thing, right? Or there's the other metaphor that America is a salad bowl. So why are we using those metaphors? How are they helpful? How are they misleading? In health sciences, when we're talking about patient and doctor relationships, when a doctor describes an illness or a patient describes an illness as a fire, as an attack, or as a puzzle, what does that do? How is it helpful? How is it limiting? Or like a specific treatment or use of medication that's like putting new paint on a dilapidated house. What's that like? So those are just a couple of examples of things that we talked about in different disciplines, but I want you to think about yours or choose a subject that you teach and think about some of the metaphors that occur. How are those metaphors helpful and how are they limiting? And if you need a thinking partner to think through this with, I know it's not always at the top of my head, so go ahead and talk to the people at your table and brainstorm a couple of metaphors that you encounter in your classroom with your students. You heard a neighbor talk about that you want to share with the group. Go ahead.
We're all a piece of the puzzle.
We're all a piece of the puzzle. And what did you find helpful or limiting about that metaphor?
Well, I do it in my class at the beginning of the school year, and we show how each one of us is a piece of the puzzle, and when you put it together, and so they can see it all fit, see how we all fit together to make a whole. And then what happens if we take one out, then the puzzle doesn't, it's not complete. We use that to talk about like words we live by, and then put in the rest of that. I don't know about how it's limiting, because we do talk about other things that mean the same. I just choose to use that one because we put it up and use it all. You can keep it all year long. And as new kids come in, we let the kid take theirs with, but then we replace it, so we always know that space was used by somebody else.
Yeah.
So I try to build in there other things we could say, but I just say this is the one I like and we're going to use it.
Right, which is a really generative way of talking about it, right? It's not their single vision, right?
Right.
That's great. And that's a metaphor that I actually use to explain the strands of Common Core, right? What's your piece of the puzzle? So those metaphors are really helpful. At some point they break down, but it's great to think about how it's helpful.
Put it back. It's never, I mean, that's the thing. It's like even if a kid leaves, or even if we get discouraged in one of the pieces of education are gone, we can fill it back. We just
Yeah.
have to be able to give ourselves that opportunity to do so.
That's great. Thank you for sharing. Yeah.
This is a new concept for me, so my mind is still trying to grab onto this metaphor way of teaching. But I do teach in peer groups, and we're always using the comparison of a team. We're a team. And if somebody on your team's having a bad day, then you need to step up because we want the whole team to be successful.
Which can be a really helpful way to help students visualize what's expected of them or how to help them treat one another. What else?
We also discussed say practice makes perfect, how that is used in reading instruction a lot, and how the debunking of that is practice makes permanent, and you might see that with handwriting in students as well.
Right.
The wrong way, maybe.
Yeah, absolutely, which can be really limiting. Yeah. What else? Did you talk about it or did you hear someone else say? Yeah.
I was thinking math, and I was thinking how metaphors are helpful sometimes. Like when we talked about the scaling triangle, and we remembered it because whenever you step on a scale, you seem to weigh a different amount. So all the sides of the scaling triangle are different.
Right. Which can be really helpful.
Yeah.
Great. One that we, Paula just mentioned as being limited, and I know you guys talked about earlier, is that witch hat for narrative, right? That metaphor where you like the plot, exposition comes at the beginning, right? That could be a really limiting metaphor, and kids can often get stuck in that, like, it's not a story if it doesn't have all of those parts in that order, right? So while it might be helpful for teaching certain vocabulary terms, it can be really limiting. So the point is to think about what are the metaphors that are helpful and why are they helpful, and to really think about that. And then if there are some limitations to those, how can we break those down for students and help them figure out what's good and what's bad about them.